Or just let you do it too.
All right, awesome. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining. Per usual, we have a few just small announcements and updates to make before we get into things. One, today we're not going to have a showcase. We had somebody lined up to do it, but at the last minute they had something come up, so they could not. So like I say in every meetup, if you're doing something cool and you come to these meetups regularly and you're not sure if a whole hour and a half is the right setting for you, but you'd love to show everybody what you're up to, please get in touch, whether email, Twitter, on the Slack. We would love to let you show off a little bit. Secondly, then, as far as future events go, next month, we are going to have a meetup with the OwnConnect co-founders. It'll be announced in the next few days. So just keep your eyes peeled on the website and on the Twitter, and we'll get the Eventbrite link up there for you. It should be a really cool one. Today, we're joined by Lynne Kiesling. She's the co-director of Carnegie Mellon's Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics, and also authors the very cool Knowledge Problem blog. We first met Lynne, like a lot of our guests, through Twitter, but our first real interaction was in a Clubhouse room we hosted a few months ago. And Lynne had sort of spontaneously joined. She did the raise hand feature and then proceeded to teach us a ton about the topic we were discussing at the time. And as soon as we shut down the Clubhouse room, sort of all of the event organizers started texting each other saying, we have to get Lynne on a meetup. So finally, we're getting Lynne on a meetup, and we're really excited to. Now, I think the focal point is going to be Lynne's recent work on Transactive Energy. However, she's done a ton of other cool stuff, and I think there's a lot we can talk about. And the goal is to keep things kind of casual. So this is just going to be conversational, no presentation or anything like that. We want to kind of treat this one sort of like the old meetups back at James's office, which maybe aren't so far away now. So Lynne, maybe just to start, I could ask, just maybe you could give us a little background about what you've been up to, maybe things you've done in the past before you got into Transactive Energy, whatever that is. And just let us learn a bit about who you are.
You bet. Thanks. And thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to get to have a conversation. I mean, Energy Twitter is great and Clubhouse is great. Seeing everyone's faces is next greatest. And at some point now with vaccinations, hopefully there will be some kind of in-person opportunity in the future. Also, if folks are, because I know there's enough people that it's probably not going to be easy to have a real fluid conversation. I've got the chat window open, so if you want to pop stuff in the chat, I'm happy to kind of parallel process. So a little bit of my background, I'm an economist, and I'm completely and absolutely passionate about the ideas of economics and have been for probably my entire adult life, to the point of complete nerdery. And I have very, very, very patient friends and family and husband. Somehow I started working on electricity when I had to write a senior honors project as an undergrad. And my mom was working as a load forecast analyst for American Electric Power at the time. And so I said, hey, Mom, I need some data for my thesis. Do you think that I can use some data from your region? And, will they let me do that? And so she checked, and I got the data on punch cards. Just to give you, but even, I mean, yeah, I'm old, but even at the time, the punch cards seemed old. And so since I was an undergrad, I've been interested in energy. I kind of went off and did some other stuff in graduate school, but always kind of related to technology and technology, innovation economics, technology history, and the economics of regulation. And so I've always been interested in regulation. I got back into energy right around the 2000, 2001 California stuff. And so have been paying attention to things like dynamic pricing and, market design ever since. And the sort of first, the digitization and the move towards smart grid and grid modernization was, I think, really important, and then amplified by the explosion of DERs and the way the DER cost curves have plummeted. So those are the kind of range of things that I'm interested in, without getting too in the weeds yet on transactive energy, which I know we're going to, but.
Cool. So electricity is a family business. That's neat. And then maybe just let us know what is the, at Carnegie Mellon, what is the institute you're helping lead? What do you do?
Yeah, so the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics was founded in 2004 at the University of Colorado Law School. And it was the outgrowth of a law student seminar team taught by Phil Weiser, who was on the law faculty at the time, and Ray Gifford, who was a former chair of the Colorado PUC. And this was a seminar on helping law students think about the foundational intellectual principles for regulating in the face of technological change. And at some point they looked at each other and said, this would be a really great seminar for regulators, because a lot of regulators, they may come from a legal background, but they don't have a lot of exposure to economics necessarily. They certainly don't have exposure to the kind of law and economics ideas. So let's hold a workshop. And so they put together this team of faculty, including me. And at the time I was working with Vernon Smith, who had just gotten a Nobel Prize in economics for basically creating the field of experimental economics. And so we decided to start this workshop where you at the Aspen Institute with PUC commissioners and staff, very small Socratic seminar, come together around a table with a shared set of readings and try to explore ideas that they could use to make better regulatory decisions in their daily lives. And part of the pedagogy was doing economic experiments. So I always kick off the workshop with what's called a double auction, which will come up when we talk about transactive energy. And in a classroom setting, and I always pretty much do this in every class that I ever taught, you take the room and of course you've got the economic supply demand model already figured out, right? So I know how many units there are, what the willingness to pay is for each unit on the demand curve, what the willingness to offer is on the supply curve. And you divvy them up and you hand them out to everyone. And you say, okay, half of your buyers, half of your sellers. If you're a buyer, here's your willingness to pay for your first, second, third unit. If you're a seller, here's your marginal cost for your first, second, third unit. And so the whole market supply and demand are accounted for. And then you tell them the rules, right? The market institution, and just let her rip and see what happens. And so it's a really visceral kind of experience of creating gains from trade. It's a really visceral producer and consumer surplus experience. And so you do multiple periods. And of course, there's a period that in there where I throw in a price cap. And so there are all of these otherwise mutually beneficial trades that can't happen. And so people get really frustrated. And so it's a great learning tool. And we have an experimental economist, Rim Baltaduonis from Gettysburg College, who brings his mobile lab, which is a set of Surface tablets, and runs a computer experiment of electricity experiments. So essentially runs like an RTO market. And, and you see the regulators there trying to withhold output to raise prices to try to exercise market power, and then getting really frustrated when they can't. So it's a good lesson it's a good way to learn about the dynamics of market processes. And we started this in 2004. Fast forward to 2017, Phil decided to run for Attorney General in the state of Colorado. And I was worried that the program was going to get orphaned. So I went out and shook the money tree and raised some foundation funding and have run it ever since. And this year, of course, with COVID, our program is virtual. It'll take place starting the 13th. And so it's very focused on regulator education around what we call our 5 prisms, which is neoclassical economics, standard kind of price theory markets, Schumpeterian dynamism, perennial gale of creative destruction, institutional and organizational economics, which is where Coase comes in, if you're familiar with Ronald Coase. The 4th prism is public choice economics. And the 5th is what we call the innovator's dilemma, drawing on Clay Christensen. And so it's very much the question on the table is always, how can we engage with regulators to have better regulatory decision making in the face of dynamic technological change? And that's what we do. And we're planning to do more, but that's what we do. After, post-COVID, we're going to do more.
I'd like to audit some of this stuff. Sounds super cool. Awesome. Well, then maybe it would be a good time to tell us a little bit about Transactive Energy. And I think we really want to hear about what you're up to and all the sort of nuance and cool stuff, but maybe just zooming out, like, what is it? What is Transactive Energy? I hear the phrase a lot. I think I know what it means, but it's kind of like microgrid. Like, what's a microgrid? Depends who you're talking to.
And everyone has their own flavor, I think. And my collaborators and I are very particular about our flavor of TE. So Transactive Energy, think of it, if this is something that's new to you, think of it as using local energy market. So using market processes and the ideas of supply, demand, market clearing, and prices as a communication mechanism, right? Because that's what they are. Prices aggregate and communicate private knowledge about willingness to pay, about opportunity costs. And that knowledge, private knowledge, is subjective. Everyone in a market has a different willingness to pay, has different preferences. Suppliers have different opportunity costs, and that's one of the things in our industry. We tend to think of costs as being very objective, because we look at kind of accounting costs, but there's actually a very subjective element to supply as well. And that's going to become really important when we start talking about people supplying things from their EV batteries. And so take that idea of using prices as signals with using market processes to coordinate, and combine that with digitization and automation. And you get an environment where you can send those price signals. You can both communicate willingness to pay and willingness to offer, so buy and sell preferences, and then use that market to generate price signals that you kick back to devices so that they can autonomously change their settings in response to those price signals. Right. So you can think of it as digitized, automated, price-based dispatch at the distribution level. It's probably the most techie way to think of it, but
and does that presume this is happening outside of the sort of structured, regulated wholesale market? Like, this is kind of something private and beyond that? Or maybe there's different flavors and it depends on just what you're into.
I think so. And I should say the work that I do is with my longtime collaborator, David Chasson. Dave's senior research, I don't remember what his full title is, but anyway, he's the research dude that heads the Gizmo lab at SLAC at Stanford. And so we've been collaborating since the Olympic Peninsula project in 2006, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But we're pretty agnostic about this. We are trying to think of it as a fairly open platform. And so you could, if you're a utility, you can use this idea to give you more granular coordination in the distribution system. But if you, say, are running a private microgrid, you could also use this to coordinate among all of the users in your microgrid. If you're a retailer, so let's just say you're in the Texas model, and so you have a bunch of retailers. If you're a retailer, you could use this essentially to aggregate and coordinate and do risk management across your customer portfolio. And of course, with FERC 2222 coming down, I think there's a lot of opportunities for aggregators and to use this. So we're thinking of this as a fairly general platform that can be customized to the needs. And if you're a utility, of course, you know, the opportunities are there. Should I give you some history? Will that, there's an origin story to
Yes, please. We love
to
the history.
Transactive Energy. Yes. Origin stories are great. I promise I won't put on like a hood or a cloak but the origin story is back in the early 2000s, Dave and a bunch of other people who were at Pacific Northwest National Lab were trying to work on this idea that they called transactive control because they're engineers. So they're coming from the point of view of control theory, that we think in terms of controlling devices. And in particular, this is the early 2000s, the devices are going to be thermostatic devices. So, you know, thermostats, water heaters, that kind of stuff. And so there was this is the part of the origin story that I like. They had this workshop, and they decided to have some experimental economists come in and give some, basically put us through some experiments. And so there's a group, an experimental economics group at Cornell that was there. Vernon and I were there. And so we did all of these kind of classroom and research type experiments. And out of that came this idea that we implemented in the Gridwise Olympic Peninsula project, which was and that project went from it was 2006, 2007. It was a field experiment. You know, in experimental economics, there's basically two categories of experiments. There's laboratory experiments, which are great because you can control the environment and really get a clean line on testing hypotheses. And then there's the field experiment, which is a little more messy, but more practical. And so we were doing a field experiment with a public utility in the Olympic Peninsula, and Bonneville was the wholesale provider, right? And there was concern about a distribution feeder out to the peninsula that was going to get really congested according to their demand forecast. And so, you know, this is the Olympic Peninsula. The place is gorgeous. It's mountainous. People move out there to be in nature. And so the last thing you're going to do is throw iron in the ground and build a, you know, fossil fuel fired power plant. There's also a lot of reasons why you would want to try to avoid expanding the distribution feeder, both for cost reasons and for kind of visual and environmental reasons. And so the P&L folks said, well, let's work on seeing if we can manage capacity utilization more effectively with some demand side automation. And then the mechanism that they decided to test was this idea of transactive energy. And so what we did was we had 130 households that signed up, and they're all located on the Olympic Peninsula. They're all, you know, we give them all sorts of information and kind of expected, you know, if you do this, here's what you should expect to see on your bill. And we divided them into 4 groups. All 4 groups had the digital technology, which was a 2-way programmable communicating thermostat. And so, and this is, you know, a fancier, more sophisticated thermostat than you could get at Home Depot at the time. It was, you know, it could receive data, it could change its settings autonomously in response to those data, and then it could also push data back out. And, you know, that kind of technology is now fairly commonplace, but it was not at the time. And so everyone has this thermostat, and they have a web interface so that they can see what's going on in their home, see how their energy is being consumed in the home. And this is electric heating is the main load. And so we divide them into 4 groups. One group just had the thermostat. The other three groups were the treatment groups in the experiment, and they each were going to get different types of contracts layered on top of their PUD bill, their regular utility bill. And so the way we implemented this was every quarter, we basically gave them a payment. We gave them some cash in an account. And then as they participated in the experiment and they consumed energy, they would draw down that account and they got to keep whatever was left. And this is a really important principle in experimental economics, salient reward. So you always pay your subjects. And so if any of you were econ majors undergrad and you were ever a subject in experiments, you probably know that experimental economists live for students who will do experiments for beer money. Those are our subjects. And because, you know, if the keep what you earn is the idea of salient reward, right? You want to keep the incentives as clean as possible. So we had three contract groups, a regular kind of typical fixed price that was calculated to be a price that had full insurance against price variability from we had a synthetic wholesale market because of course there's no open competitive market in the Northwest. So we created a synthetic wholesale market. The second contract group was the time of use with a critical peak. And so the automation was not just in the TOU, which is pretty easy automation, right? You can do that with a Home Depot thermostat, but the automation was the automating the response to the critical peak when it came, when there was an ice storm, for example. And then the third, and this was the part that I helped design, the third contract type was the real-time price. And the real-time price, we implemented what is the bread and butter of experimental economics, which is the double auction. And this double auction is actually the research from 1962 for which Vernon was awarded the Nobel Prize, was basically kind of kicking the tires on this market design. And the way a double auction works is you have, I already described it, you have buyers who have willingness to pay, you have sellers who have offer prices, what they're willing to accept. And in every market period, everyone submits their bid, which reflects their willingness to pay on the buy side. On the sell side, the suppliers submit their offer, their willingness to accept. And in every market period, the algorithm constructs the demand curve out of all the bids, the supply curve out of all the offers, identifies, discovers the market clearing price. And then the automation pushes that price out to the devices. And then the devices will behave in accordance with the owner's preferences. And they had a setting, so you could go for more economy, which would mean you have a lower willingness to pay, or more comfort, which means you have a higher willingness to pay. And so for those of you who are old hands at wholesale power markets, and this is not a wholesale power market, but this is where the issue comes up, you know that lack of elasticity is a real problem, right? Really steep demand curves are a huge problem in electricity markets. And so what these thermostats are doing by reflecting each individual's willingness to pay, they're putting some elasticity there, right? You've got this inelastic, non-responsive load, but then you've got those thermostats that are putting some elasticity in there in the middle of the demand curve. And so that can help curb price spikes, that can help keep prices down. And of course, this is I've learned a ton of engineering doing this work as a non-engineer. This is where I learned that thermal mass is your friend, and that if you say, I'm only willing to pay X, and so your heat goes out, you know, if you have enough elasticity in the market, that high price interval is not going to last for too long. And so by the time the price goes back down and your heat kicks back on, you haven't really lost any comfort, right? So thermal mass is your friend. And we really pushed the envelope on this. Our market period was 5 minutes. And so this market clearing happened every 5 minutes for a year. And so we ran this experiment, and the people on the real-time contract, they saved about 20% on their bill, which was the largest saving. The people on the TOU contract, they conserved about, I think 10, 15%. We had a peak reduction of about 15%. So the load duration really flattened. And so if you're talking about trying to do capacity utilization in a constrained wires network, I think this is a pretty good system. All right, so that's the origin story.
That's super interesting. One question that comes to mind, if I'm in the group that has the transactive energy settings and such, and I'm contemplating my willingness to pay, did someone like come up with, like you said, like aggressive versus comfortable, you know, putting it in human terms as opposed to, you know, cents per kilowatt hour? Like, did you somehow create a means by which people could kind of understand what it means?
That is so exactly the right question. Thank you. It's perfect. This is the engineers, a couple of engineers really had a field day with this, because yeah, you have to take this thermostat setting and turn it into a bid, right? How do you do that? And so for us, we think of, and by us, I mean me and Dave, we think of this as Transactive Energy 1.0, right? This is kind of prices to devices. And the way that that comfort setting got turned into a price was a very engineering kind of, you know, building engineer. There's like a deadband around the temperature setting, and you know, you first find out what the homeowner's preferred temperature setting is, and then you just kind of apply some kind of gradient to moving away from that. And you know, from an engineering perspective, that's really clever and a good place to start. What I think, and since then, and right, that was 15 years ago, and so I think Transactive Energy has been really slow to deploy, because you've got a bunch of these technical questions, like exactly like this one. And also, I think the different people have these different flavors of transactive energy, and some of them are very cost driven, right? So you can think of it in terms of like the utility has a system objective, and so they can evaluate what their system cost is of, you know, avoiding some particular a peak or some particular cost, and you push that cost out. So it's the utility's opportunity cost that gets reflected in the price that gets pushed out, and then the homeowner can choose to respond yes or no. Then there are others, like there's Ed Cazalet, who's working with Southern California Edison, and he takes a more financial market oriented approach, where, you know, he thinks of it in terms of tenders and kind of an order book, the way you would think of like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So what we're trying to do is to move away from the you know, the kind of engineered comfort bid connection to one where you have the device in your home, and for now we can just kind of think of it just as a thermostat, and that you can actually, as a homeowner, you submit some kind of bid function, or the device comes to you pre-programmed with a bidding function. And that, you know, this is going to take some time to develop, because we have to socialize the idea of this, right? Because what are we all used to? We're all used to, you know, I flip the switch and the light goes on, right? How many cents per kilowatt hour am I paying? I mean, I know because I'm kind of nerdy about this, but normal human beings don't really know that stuff. And so kind of, I think, constructing a narrative around, you know, around how to associate your willingness to pay with your comfort level, or and then turning that into a bidding function, is one of the areas of research that we're really focused on.
Very interesting. I mean, one more thing I think that comes to mind is, like, I've wondered if you could show someone say, rather than using cents per kilowatt hour, you could say, I don't want to pay more than 20% the weighted average price.
Mhm.
But what you don't know is how often that happens, like what you're really signing up for. But you could show someone historically, like what that would have meant for them, right?
Yeah.
Well, that means 75 hours out of the year, you're in the cold or whatever. Is there some element of like, obviously, you know, the past doesn't indicate the future, but it sort of does, right? Is there some element of like, if you choose this, here's what you would have been exposed to help people kind of get an intuitive sense of like what they're doing?
Yeah, I think that's an important way to go, is to do exactly that. And part of what we're doing in the current project that we're working on, developing Transactive Energy 2.0, and you know, we're not the only ones working on this. Other people are also working on this idea of bidding functions, right? So it's a pretty active area of research. But we're working on that as well. And, you know, bidding functions for your PV, because, you know, your PV is going to just sell, right? And so what are the offer prices? What are the offer prices that your PV should sell at? And at a kind of technical engineering level, right? Once you've satisfied your uses for your PV within the home, right? So you're comfortable and you have as much coffee as you need and your phone is as charged as you need it. You've got excess generation to sell. At some level, at a technical level, your opportunity cost is zero. But the economics of that, I think, is more complicated, because if you really want to make money off your PV, you could change the setting on your thermostat so you're using less energy, and figure out different ways to use energy in the home, right? So the opportunity cost facing the homeowner is not just that kind of technical engineering device opportunity cost. And so how do we come up with a bidding function for that? But right now, we're just, with PV, we're just using an opportunity cost of zero, just to kind of, as we build things. And then it gets even more interesting and fascinating, I think, when you think about the electric vehicle, right? Because the EV in the olden days, you know, consumers were consumers and producers were producers, and never the twain shall meet. And we have this one way, right? The one-way road, the grid being architected for one-way flow from generators to end users. And now, of course, with EV and now also with storage and solar plus storage, as an economic actor, the homeowner is going to be a different agent. Right? The homeowner is not just a consumer. The homeowner can choose when to be a consumer or when to be a producer, depending on his or her opportunity costs. You know, what do you have going on? Do you need to drive the car 50 miles, or are you going to ride your bike for the next 2 days? Right. So I think that, you know, coming up with bidding functions that reflect the true economic opportunity costs of the homeowner, of the user, is going to be really important and hard.
I have a question, Duncan, if I could jump in here. And forgive me, Lynn. First of all, thanks for being here. I've loved interacting with you on Twitter and Clubhouse and stuff. Always learn a lot from you.
Likewise.
I'm not an economist myself, so this may sound silly. I'm trying to reason this out in real time, and hope you can help me. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about as of late is this concept of value of lost load in ERCOT, which
isn't it just $9,000, and we know that, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. Like, and you know, that basically this blanket price on load, it, you know, losing load that it's put on the market, which I think, you know, it's probably pretty scary in a lot of people's minds to suggest to remove the price cap, but it does artificially constrain this, you know, concept of lost load and what people are willing to actually receive as a benefit to take their load offline. But the, you know, the second problem with it is I don't think it's the right term, but I've been thinking about it in terms of like liquidity, I guess, is that the load that we want to take offline and send this $9,000 price signal to actually doesn't even have access to the market. So there's no like, there's, except for maybe Griddy being the exception, that was really the only function that would pass this price signal down to end customers. And, I'm not quite so sure that's the answer either. I think we spend a lot of time at David Energy trying to figure out basically how to try and figure this out as the retailer. So, but like, which is still taking a sort of supply centric model to this, right? Like we're out buying supply for this customer and we have to try and discover how much value we need to offer them to take load offline when it's expensive for us to buy. But what you're suggesting is basically like an inversion of this model, right? Like, so here's where I'm actually winding up to a question is within kind of how we've constructed supply markets with this concept of value of lost load, how do you actually have a customer like bid load in a sense? You know what I mean? Like they are, bidding their demand, like their willingness to pay, I guess, into the market. But it's really kind of an exact 180 on how we look at things now with suppliers serving load. So do you think it's like possible to like, how would we even start to try and integrate this on a more market-wide basis that isn't just like a simple demand response program? Here's your dollar per kW, which, as you pointed out, is usually the avoided cost of the utility or of the market and not the actual price of load for that, lost load for that customer.
There's so many dimensions in that question. That's such a great question. I think to maybe start on a philosophical level, yeah, value of lost load is an administrative estimate. And we've we've lived on administrative estimates of stuff in this industry for over a century, right? This is what we do. And so I think part of it is that the technology now with digitization, with smart meters, that it enables, and especially as you have more devices that are able to be connected and take as read things like interoperability, cybersecurity, right? Take all that as given, which is a big take as given because that stuff has to happen and it's not always happening at the pace or in the way that we want it to, and it's not cheap. But that with a more digitized grid, and this actually going back to the discussion of IRLE and our 5 prisms, this is that institutional organizational economics prism with Ronald Coase. Digitization has reduced transaction costs. And so we see this in the entire economy, right? From Amazon to Zillow, digitization has reduced transaction costs for all of us. And we are now able to do more things through market relationships that we used to have to do through what we call hierarchy, right? So one thing that that digitization in reducing transaction costs can do is it can enable us to find different market designs that don't rely as heavily on those administrative estimates of stuff like value of lost load, right? And so I think part of what I hope the substantive conversation will be that comes out of the Texas event is a real rethink of what are some of the dimensions of the market design, what are some of the rules in the market design that we can revisit now that we have so many more digitally connected devices that can participate. And then working downward, I mean, this is part of and I was really psyched to hear some people in the FERC technical conference on the grid of the future last week say exactly this, that the lines between wholesale and retail are becoming super blurry. And that, the jurisdictional lines between retail and wholesale were encased in amber in 1935. And, the legal apparatus and the administrative framework have been written around that. But in reality, the technology is really making that no longer the case. And so then getting down into the distribution level, which is where I think Transactive Energy, it draws insights from wholesale power market design, but also is a very bottom-up distribution level platform. I think a lot of the interesting idea is going to be that if you have transactive systems, a lot of the kind of transactions and disturbances that currently get dealt with in wholesale markets can now be dealt with locally, right? Because most disturbances are local phenomena. And so if you can use local markets and transactive systems to deal with them locally, that can give you different outcomes, which I'm not sure if that's a full answer to your very complicated question, but.
No, it's great. I even have a way of maybe simplifying my question in a more direct sort of, reductive way, which is, do you think it's the right model to basically let the value of lost load settle at whatever price it is? And two, is like that ever going to be a politically feasible idea if it is the most like economically correct way to go about it? Like, is their load so critical that you can't even think of putting a price on it, right? Or of losing that load, and what that would really do to electricity markets? I could see it happening at the grid edge first, like for sure, and community microgrids and stuff like that. But to then conceive of it happening at the wholesale level, like those would be kind of the two questions we'd have to address, I guess.
Yep, I agree. Yeah, and to Duncan's earlier point about who's the audience, or who's going to use these transactive systems, and obviously utility platform is one way to think of it, but you can think of it as also microgrids, and I can think of use cases which around community solar, right? And so I may kind of be lazy when I talk about homeowners, but that doesn't mean that more community-based resources can't take advantage of this, because it really is very much about using price-based dispatch and using markets to coordinate and to both coordinate in the short term, but then also reveal the underlying cost and benefit structure so that people will have better informed investment decisions that they can make. And so it's a way to participate. And so if you have that kind of community ethos, to me, Transactive Energy fits right there. And I know like LO3 Energy, for example, in the Brooklyn microgrid, that's been one of their main ways of thinking about transactive. So since you said community solar, that just kind of went off in my head.
I think Matt's actually in here from LO3.
Howdy.
Hi, Matt.
Yeah.
How are you?
Very interesting. I'm well, thanks. Yeah. No, +1 to the community solar discussion for sure. Hopefully have something to come out on that front soon enough. But these are certainly the right questions, and I think in the chat a lot of those getting at user engagement is a key hurdle in a practical commercial setting.
Yeah, so I see Kristen has asked about user engagement permutations. At least in our experiments, we tend to focus on price, on just kind of price, and so far it's been thermostatic load. So, but now fast forward, when we did the original Olympic Peninsula work, that's mid 2000s, and the DERs were just not a thing yet. And now, with the way costs have been plummeting and the interest in DER construction, investment, interconnection, and how are the utilities going to manage all of this? And so it's still, in my mind, it's still using transactive energy for coordination and managing capacity utilization. It's not necessarily just a feeder capacity. It's a broader concept of capacity utilization, right? System capacity. But So yeah, we haven't focused on that, but like, Matt said, I think they are thinking more about different permutations. But at least when we talk about what we're doing right now, we really think of it as, and I'm not an engineer. And so I think it was like a sponge, right? Making the distribution system a sponge and increasing the absorptive capacity of the distribution system to be able to absorb DERs. So,
that's really cool, actually. I think I just finished this book called Energy at the End of the World, and I can't stop talking about it. It's about Orkney Island, and it's kind of getting at what your point about the Olympic Peninsula. It's this isolated region, and at some point they were like, you've got to stop sending energy back, stop making renewable, stop installing wind turbines. And so the island was like, great, we'll just consume more electricity. So yeah, I think the sponge analogy is a great one. It's like, how do you get energy consumers to be prosumers?
Yeah.
How do you really make that conversion? So cool. I love your talk so far.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think and then Carl has asked about thinking in terms of homeowners investing in what, of course, economists boringly call consumer durables. And understanding the value of return on investment. And I think uncertainty in the revenue, and this is where, if I kind of wear my heart on my sleeve, I am very much retail competition, retail choice as a means of consumer protection and consumer empowerment person. Which is why I've always been, a huge fan of an analytical fan of the Texas model, because I think there the idea of quarantining the footprint that still has the natural monopoly characteristics, which is the transmission and distribution wires and substations, right? That's the part of the supply chain that still has the natural monopoly economies of scale and scope. But obviously generation and wholesale is competitive. Retail is or should be competitive in all places. And I think quarantining the monopoly and making sure that the monopoly can't have anti-competitive downstream effects in retail markets, including EV charging, including solar, is to me really important for economic surplus, for welfare, for value creation. But I think, Carl, I think a lot about your question about, does an uncertainty in the revenue substantially undermine the value proposition? Because, and this is where I think the role for retailers and the role for aggregators is really important. And that if we think about the future utility business model, in my world, if I were kind of the queen or Uber regulator or whatever, I would implement the Texas model and have really low entry barriers in retail markets. And I think that aggregation would emerge organically, and that the business model for retailers and aggregators would be one of risk management, that the way they make their money is by managing risk. And so, they could be using a transactive system, but their customers who don't necessarily want to experience the volatility, they could put them on some kind of a more price stabilized contract and have the ability to control their devices. So they're using the homeowner's devices transactively and basically sharing the revenue with the customer, but keeping some for themselves because in return for their risk management function that they're performing. I don't know, Carl, does that kind of get at some of what you had in mind?
It makes a ton of sense, and I agree. I think where I get a little hung up though with transactive energy, and actually you don't need to take it out of transactive energy. You look at the way that people finance solar today still, right? And you've got to finance it on the back of a long-term contract with steady revenue, right? You can't just say, I'm going to bid it to the wholesale market at real-time prices and hope it works out. Nobody's going to finance you, right? And so that holds all the way down, to the homeowner level. If I'm thinking about, okay, I really want to go solar. Okay, now do I do a 1.5 kilowatt system because I want to make sure it's 100% self-consumed, or am I going to put in a 5 kilowatts? Well, I'm not going to make that latter decision if I have any uncertainty on the revenue on the backside of that transaction. And so how you sort of balance it so you get the right incentives. So I mean, I get that you don't necessarily want to be paying everybody a retail price for export under all circumstances, but the benefit of that model is that people like know what they're getting, so they can make a rational decision about their investment. So I think there needs to be a way of balancing that. And I do think that I sort of alluded to that, right? I think that there's an opportunity for somebody to come in and kind of like hedge that risk, and really sophisticated counterparty that can price that risk and roll it into the contract, essentially.
Yeah, to Lynne's earlier point on wholesale blurring with retail. I mean, a power plant on someone's roof is basically like a wholesale power plant with distribution benefits. So we've talked a lot about how they should get a distribution credit from the utility, and then it should just act as sort of a generation plant. And retailers can hedge that for 3 to 5 years, like an offtake agreement. So there's a way to, I think, move far beyond NEM, I guess, in that sense, like get the best of both worlds in a way. Just my 2 cents, though.
Yeah, I had a funny interaction with a prominent former politician who's now president of a university and used to be my boss. And he's a board member of a utility, but also a very market-oriented guy. And so I remember, we were getting to know each other, and he was asking about my research, and he asked me about net metering. And I knew I'd already talked to him about digitization and technology and so on. And he asked me about net metering, and I said, I think that net metering is an analog era regulation that is ill-suited to a digital network. And, and he's on the board of a utility, and he's kind of like, and then he's like, and then I talked about, transactive energy as an alternative to net metering, and that if we transitioned out of net metering into transactive energy, that's a different way for DER owners to monetize their assets. I think I got him to come around, but I think that's really important, and it's challenging because and we see the tensions and the fractures in net metering, especially in California, and some of the equity issues. And so I think moving to a transactive system as a substitute for net metering, and especially if you have community solar and all kinds of people can participate, even if they don't own a roof that they can put panels on, I think that kind of empowerment to me is a lot more empowering than an analog era regulation about spinning the dials backwards.
Although I have to say, like, to play devil's advocate a little bit, like there's still a player in that transaction that you have a very illiquid market, right? What's the value of that distribution benefit? What's the value of that non-miles alternative? You have a player that can manipulate voltage, right? That your system's sitting behind, which is going to change the value that you get from it. So it's not it's the free market construct, kind of sometimes in practice starts to break down when you have a monopoly entity sitting in the center of it.
Yeah. And I'm kind of a pink-haired punk about this, but I do think that I would love to see a future in which DER owners can provide voltage regulation, and you have a market, a local market for voltage regulation, local markets for reactive power, and the ability to do that autonomously. And so that might be, and so, if you ask that, and I say, well, okay, Lynne, you're sounding like you're very kind of free market, low regulatory hurdles, which is yes, but not zero regulatory hurdles, right? So you still want the regulators to do anti-fraud, you still want them to do credit in, and providing information to consumers. And it may well be that kind of establishing and monitoring that voltage level might be a useful regulatory function. and just say, okay, you know, here's the limits on how many excursions how far your excursions can go. And so we're not gonna let you do that. But I'm not an engineer, so I need to caveat that. Do we want to, in the chat, Michael has this really interesting question about how can low regulation spur risk management, and the lesson from the Texas crisis is that competitive retail systems drive retailers to distinguish themselves by dropping their prices low. Yeah, I think the current Texas market design, certainly there are some dimensions for improvement. And I think there's still enough of the mindset around, you know, small customers don't want to be bothered. Small customers just want to be able to flip the switch and have the light go on. And that may very well be true, but small customers also can now use digital technologies to protect themselves from price volatility, from, you know, and increasingly we're going to have DERs to protect ourselves from outages. So I think there's some work to do to update the market design in places like, not just ERCOT. I mean, ERCOT's the least, I'm going to say the least bad, but that sounds worse than I mean it to be, of all of the RTO market designs, in my opinion. But it's there. I think that there's some room for improvement in terms of specifying and enabling that kind of risk management, for sure. And I should say we're getting right to the edge, because I am an economist and I'm not a financial economist. So I can say Black-Scholes and wave my hand, but that's kind of where I may hit my limit in terms of the financial end of what goes on in markets.
I have a really basic question. I feel like that's what all my questions always are. So when you look at like the Texas market, right, which is, I'd say, like very focused on retailers, to the extent that like your bill has the retailer's logo on it, not the distribution utilities logo on it. And there's no default service from the distribution utility. There's like NRG or whoever's the sort of like retailer of last resort or whatever they call that. And then you compare that to the experience in, say, New York, which is somewhat unpopular to the extent now that there are these laws that retailers can only like offer prices to homeowners that are at the utility's default or less. And there's all these folks who kind of like campaign to limit this because there supposedly were these bad experiences with people getting hosed, you know, like it seems like there's just such different experiences happening just with the core concept of retail choice, like not even sort of like any interesting questions beyond that, just like, are people, particularly in resi, I mean, not sort of B2B stuff, like in New York, we almost seem to be saying people aren't very capable of making these decisions unless they're like simple and obvious. Whereas in Texas, we seem to be saying, no, like people can think through this. Why are these, what's going on here? Like it's very confusing to watch from the outside, not as someone who's not a participant or thinker on kind of retail power.
This is where the Chatham House rules thing might, things I might say if we weren't recording, but I do think, and this is also just coming as putting on my economic historian hat and looking at the history of the industry and its technological and social and political evolution. I think certainly from 1907 onward, and 1907 was the date of the first establishment of the first PUCs in Wisconsin and New York. And so, you know, at the time, Wisconsin was the hotbed of progressivism. So this is kind of the guts of the progressive era. And the establishment of the PUC in Wisconsin is one thing that's symbolic of that. that from the early 20th century through, certainly through the New Deal, you're building this culture of electricity as a social technology. And it has a particular social function and social purpose, and it is socially uplifting, and that mindset gets ingrained in the legislation, it gets ingrained in the regulation. The other piece of that mindset that also gets ingrained is the idea that little guys need to be protected from big, bad, evil, nasty corporations. And so you get, and I'm gonna say it, you get that kind of paternalism that you're hearing in New York is just embedded. It's embedded in the culture and embedded in the mindset. And yeah, I reject that paternalism. At the same time as saying that consumers can make their own decisions, I will also say that obviously utilities have behaved badly and abused their political and their economic power. And so we have a lot of lack of trust. But one of the nice things about digitization is that technology enables us as individual consumers to protect ourselves and to empower ourselves and to go out and increasingly, as we have more DERs and electric vehicles that we can use to, keep our house running, even if it's only at 55 degrees when the ERCOT outages run for 4 days. Right. So I think paternalism is a big part, and the combination of paternalism and a lack of trust are some of the things that have been embedded in the regulatory landscape, and they're going to be hard to disentangle because they've become such a part of the culture. In addition to the fact that they become embedded in what is a very legalistic, procedure-oriented landscape, as any of you who have ever looked at a regulatory docket knows.
I think Jed had a question. I'm not sure if he's here still.
The intersection of franchise rights, DERs providing local reliability, and transactive energy. That's an interesting intersection. Yes, I would like to hear more.
Go
Yeah,
on,
so
Jed.
yeah, I'll go on a short rant.
I didn't bring up franchise rights. Jed did, so I'm off the hook.
No, I'm always.
Hey,
always
Jed,
good
did
for
I
it.
just follow you on Twitter today? I think I did. Are you
think
now
so.
James's colleague?
I am. Yes.
Yes, congratulations. I just followed
Thank
you.
you.
on Twitter,
Thank
so.
you.
I'm not
Hopefully we'll-
congratulating you for my following you on Twitter.
Oh no, that too.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, as we know, most disturbances in reliability happen at a very local level. But for instance, I can't throw a line over to my neighbor's fence and give him, share a generator with him because of franchise rights. So it seems difficult to me to address the reliability question with DERs without addressing franchise rights in some fashion, because my experience has been the utilities are not going to be, in most cases, now there'll be some exceptions, but in most cases, they're not going to be overly helpful in allowing people to form local transactive energy markets that provide reliability to each other.
Yeah. This is a question that interests me greatly and has frustrated me Well, it hasn't frustrated me as much as my old friend Tom Caston, who back in the 80s, I think it was, had a contract here in Chicago to do combined heat and power for McCormick Place. And for those of you who haven't been to Chicago, McCormick Place is a big kind of convention center, but it has two buildings, a bigger one and a smaller one, with Lakeshore Drive going in between them. So a big kind of 6-lane, highway. And they wanted to do CHP for the entire thing. And in order to get the required ROI, they had to do CHP on that entire thing, and ComEd wouldn't let them run the wire under Lakeshore Drive. And so the only economics that they had was in the big one, and it just didn't pencil out. So you're just like, yeah, so franchise rights. The other way I tend to think about this is, we're not gonna be able to whittle away the market power of the utility the way Uber did with taxis, right? Because Uber just showed up and started doing stuff that people liked. And by the time the taxi industry noticed, it was too late because consumers were happy. And I don't think that's going to happen in electricity. I think, maybe it was James who said it before, right? It's going to be around the distribution edge. If you set up like new microgrids and maybe negotiate having a particular contract to be connected to the grid, but without the horrendous standby charges. So yeah, for me, I think, and this is where the I am not an engineer is just, I wonder how far we could get with a regulatory requirement that the utility provide all parties of any size with a standardized interconnection. And so that's going to have the interoperability embedded in it. It's going to have essentially the interconnection fee embedded in it. How far can we get if we just go the regulatory requirement for standardized interconnection and interoperability? I don't know.
It'd be a start. We had a very similar situation in Philadelphia with Drexel and University of Pennsylvania, the CHP, but there wasn't even a street going in between them, that they couldn't transact. But yeah, no, I don't know the answer, which is why I asked. And I don't know, I mean, I know how much difficulty we've had getting standard interconnection processes, even for 100 kilowatt customers. So yeah, it's certainly a challenge.
I will say New York is definitely thinking a lot about, obviously under New York Rev and VEDR, like probably one of the more forward-thinking markets. And they do in the VEDR proceedings say that on a case-by-case basis, you can bring forward to the PSC a exception to franchise rights. Or like a lot of people don't know that actually. So it'll be interesting to see if anything actually emerges. I mean, even, I think certain utilities do this sort of in their own way. Like Hudson Yards is the best example in New York. Like that was, I know it's technically one private development, but it spans like multiple city blocks. Those are technically public roads, but Con Ed let them build a district energy system. So I think in markets like New York and California, we will start to see those cases emerge, especially because reliability is such a problem in California. So I don't know, Jed, maybe wait a couple years. It'll answer itself.
James, can I piggyback on what Jed was talking about and what Lynne's response actually? Like, I think that this is getting into like the practical versus the philosophical or ideal. And so I guess I'm wondering what your take is on, outside of experimental economics, what is the roadmap, like the crawl, walk, run approach where you like kind of get something going and then for the highest value to the grid or the system so that everybody realizes that it works, that kind of thing. If you could just kind of talk about that.
I think that's a great question. And I am and have been for my entire career and have, published articles where I'm banging the drum on this, been a huge advocate for the benefits of experimentation. And that, and I know whether it's just kind of experimentation with different regulatory regimes or regulators allowing for experimentation with different technologies or different architectures. So I think experimentation is really important. The other thing, and this actually gets me back into the transactive energy comment, because starting in 2019, Dave has been leading, and I'm part of the team on our Transactive Energy 2.0 project, which is called TESS, Transactive Energy Service System. And we're actually building the platform. And it's you know, the hardware, the software, the market design, which is my part of it, and starting to think about building the bidding functions. And we have a DOE funded project that started in October 2019 with Holy Cross Energy in Colorado. And they have built some affordable housing in Basalt. And because, you know, Aspen housing prices have crept down valley. And so now nothing in the Roaring Fork is affordable. So they've built some affordable housing in Basalt, and it's all tricked out, right? It's got PV on the roof. It's got the EV charger setup. It's got a battery hookup native. You know, the water heater has digital sensors, the whole schmear. And so they're using NRELs. NREL's got some nodes, you know, a new kind of distribution control system. I'm not sure if it's DERMS or what, and we're part of that project, and we're testing out this idea of transactive energy. And in their particular case, it's to a utility objective, right? To help them manage their coincident peak with their wholesale procurement. But what we're seeing when we go out and look for projects, we're seeing that co-ops are willing to come play in the sandbox. And, you know, they have less regulatory apparatus to deal with. They can get kind of member and board buy-in, I think, in a relatively flatter hierarchy. And so that's another sort of experimentation, is, you know, have the co-ops being willing to guinea pig, because they are higher up on the marginal benefit curve, right? They see the, you know, especially in a place like Holy Cross Energy, where, you know, there's wildfires in their backyard every summer. And, you know, you've got a lot of members who are very, very adamant about decarbonization. And so from both the demand side and the threat side, you have this push for more DERs, more decentralization, and digital coordination of that. And so to the extent that the co-ops can kind of be guinea pigs, and other utilities can look and say, oh, hey, they did that, we can do that. Hopefully that will get them from crawl to walk. I don't see any run yet. I want to see run.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm like a recovering utility employee, and I can just say, you know, starting at run is like the worst thing you could do. So thinking that you're going to get all the residential houses in a transactive market, that's exactly where their mind goes. But sort of narrowing the scope initially and trying to get the low-hanging fruit, I think, is a good idea.
Yeah. And this gets to Tim's, and Tim is up early. Good morning, Tim. How are you? Tim has a question in the chat. He says, let's be honest, it's going to be tough getting consumers to learn to have agency when they've been told they can't have it, and they need to depend on regulators to look after them. I think, you know, this kind of crawl to walk progression is going to be the way to go. You know, people have to, I think this is going to be an experiential learning phenomenon. And people, you know, but I also, as a putting on my historian of technology hat, you know, when these things came out 13 years ago, you know, I thought people who were willing to spend the night in line overnight at the Apple store, I thought they were crazy. But some people just are early adopters, and I think this is a natural human phenomenon of technology adoption, that there are people who are early adopters either because they're enthusiasts or because they're wealthy and they like to play with things. And so I'm perfectly happy to have high income folks guinea pig technology for us. But but in this case, I think, you know, that there will be some early adopters, people who see the high marginal benefit of the digitization and the transactive approach, because they are in situations where they have resilience challenges and they have a management structure that they can experiment with more flexibility. And in my work with regulators, I try to encourage them to reduce the barriers to experimentation in their states.
Lynn, I would offer just, there's a geographic dispersion to this too. Europe and Japan are leading on these concepts in a commercial setting, in large part in Europe due to the energy communities regulation, which is sort of mandated at the EU level, and that's forcing this community model as more of an opportunity for retail providers. And so coming up with new business models to optimize customer value in that context, you know, as with everything, this comes down to, do we solve a commercial pain point with this type of platform or not? And in markets, to Lynn's earlier point about net metering, you know, where feed-in tariffs have lapsed, UK, Japan, Germany, moving beyond feed-in tariff models, the onus is on the retailers to come up with new compensation models. How are they going to do that? You know, it is more likely to be dynamic in the form of what system value, or how is that tied to the scheduling and coordination, wholesale procurement, those types of issues. And I think that's where you'll start to see this come similarly on the community solar side. And, you know, there are a couple questions about low and moderate income, you know, protections here.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of ways you could apply this actually as an opportunity for LMI folks, particularly with discounted products like aligning load with solar when it's available, you know, at the low marginal cost, you know, it's almost a new rate design. So I think VEDR and some of the, a lot of that shows up here too. Sorry, Lynn, just 2 cents.
I think that sounds great. And yeah, I noticed there are a couple of comments in the chat about, and Carl particularly raised this, grappling with the fact that, you know, that we have differences in agency. I like the use of the word agency here. And there's an extent to which, right, the low income and elderly customers have agency through consumer advocates. But I think that's another kind of audience where I would love to get some traction and some outreach, because I think consumer advocates in their regulatory role, they tend to still be very much in the adversarial mindset against the utility, and not as comfortable with the idea of thinking of technology as being a way to empower their audience, to empower the vulnerable consumers. One thing, and we're not going to be able to do this within the Holy Cross Energy project, but we've got a proposal. We got a couple of proposals out to continue working on the test project. And one thing that Dave and I want to do is, because what's essentially happening is, from the utilities perspective, the DER owners are creating value, they're creating economic welfare, they're creating surplus by enabling the utility to avoid its wholesale coincident peak. And so what they're doing is they're creating some, the DER owners are creating some value, and you want to make sure that they get paid for creating that value, that they get some share of that value. And you know, the coincident peak is only known at the end of the month. So you have this, you know, the month of activity, and then you have the settlement at the end of the month. And so one thing that we want to do is we want to use essentially a blockchain-based token system, and to basically have the DER owners keep track of their actions that are contributing to this value creation, and then at the end of the month be able to pay them for that. And so, and we want to use in cooperative game theory, it's called a Shapley value. calculation, which is a way to, when you have a group of people who have collectively created some surplus, how do you share the surplus among them? And it's a game theoretic concept, but and one of the reasons that we want to work on this is to try to flatten the income distribution effects of it's certainly, like, for example, we're seeing with net metering and solar in California, some of the frictions that are coming up there.
Can I step in and offer a comment? I don't know the
Hi,
process.
John.
Yeah, hi, how are you? I'm John Cooper. I have a company called Next Energy. And I wanted to underscore a couple things that Lynn has brought up. One is co-ops. I would 100% agree. I think there is an unmet potential out there with going small, and looking at the co-ops and the relationship they have with the municipalities in their service territory, because we're also seeing municipalities start to value resilience. And Mayor, now this is opposite my theory, but I just saw a clip on Twitter from Mayor Turner in Houston. That's not small, but Houston has a real focus on resilience. And I think these experiments are possible with the co-ops, that we're not going to find that level of cooperation with the IOUs. And conceivably city-owned utilities give you both, the city. So I think there's a lot of potential to experiment with small cities, and probably in the resilience target zones, the wildfires, the hurricanes, and so on. I'm bullish on that. And I'm a real big fan of what Lynn and David are doing, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, and Tim has mentioned and speaking of what Dave and I are doing, Tim has mentioned in the chat that he thinks the big problem for Transactive Energy is the existing distribution tariffs. And actually, Dave and our co-author Marie-Louise Arlt, who's in Munich, and I are working on a journal article that will be forthcoming in Energies. So you'll see it. I'm going to push it very enthusiastically on all the social medias, where we do exactly this, right? The questions of, okay, we have this kind of idealized greenfield concept of transactive energy, but when you go into a brownfield setting, you have an existing tariff, an existing rate structure, existing ways the utility does stuff. How do you offer transactive energy as an alternative within the existing tariff? Oh, and that has been very, very challenging for us.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting, right? If you're doing transactive energy on the supply side, but say you have a distribution rate with monthly peak demand charges, my willingness to pay depends on if that moment in time is aligned with when my monthly peak is going to be. And so my willingness to pay is dynamic. But I probably don't know that or like know how to deal with it. Like I sort of need someone to run the optimization for me and come up with what my willingness to pay ought to be based on the other forms of cost I'll experience. Is that like, and maybe that's more of like a CNI thing than a Resi thing. But like, has that come up?
Nope, not yet. I mean, we're thinking about it at a simpler level. Is really just, the kinds of customers who would be well suited, and I should say, this obviously being on a transactive contract is not necessarily going to be right for everyone, right? And in the same way that in Texas, Griddy was a niche product. And I'm really, now that I have found out that Pat Wood told me that they literally that week were going to start issuing essentially price insurance contracts to their customer, that their customers could choose some price insurance. And that just breaks my heart. It absolutely breaks my heart. But and now I've totally lost my train of thought because now I'm thinking about Griddy. That I really have lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, Duncan, can you say what you said again? I need a prompt.
I was just sort of saying my willingness to pay is going to be dynamic based on the other charges I'll experience and some optimization there.
Yeah, so if you think about the type of customer who would be interested in a transactive contract, if presented a menu of options that already exists, what's that customer going to already have? Probably a net metering, and in Holy Cross Energy's case, if you go look at their tariff, they probably have net metering, and they have what's called a distribution flexibility rider that you can put on top of that. And so they have this like pancake layer of things in their tariff that you can do if you own DERs. And TE has to compete against that, right? So in econ geek speak, their outside options are already pretty a daunting competition for the transactive contract. Yeah.
Duncan, to your point, I think an example, that we've explored in the context of existing tariffs, where places where net metering is below full retail and in some cases below the energy charge itself, you can set a floor price at that level, guarantees the asset owner the status quo, at minimum for their exported value. And then to the extent there's demand above and beyond that, you're giving customers the opportunity, to bid for that, or you could allocate that at some price above that level. And that essentially is a retail choice on the consumer side. Prosumers remain whole with an opportunity to earn a premium.
Cool.
Cool.
Well,
So-
I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump soon. So I want to get to Kristen's prompt about, because I am definitely a bookie person. I would say right now, probably my favorite recommendation might be Carlson's biography of Tesla. So I'm a huge fan of Tesla, mad genius. For those of you who do smart cities, there's a guy, Alain Berthaud, spelled French, but that has a great book. But the classic for smart cities, thinking about cities, is Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities.
That's a good reminder for me to finally read that book. I read all about it, but I've never actually read it.
Jane Jacobs, she's one of my sheroes. And the other book I would recommend is from one of my other sheroes, Eleanor Ostrom's Governing the Commons, because there's and Eleanor Ostrom was fantastic. She's was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. I think that was 2011, if I recall correctly, maybe 2009. I don't know. Time is a flat circle for me at this point, but I think that there's a really important extent to which we don't think about the distribution grid as a common pool resource to the extent that we should. There's a lot of people that do a lot of loose talk about reliability as a public good. Yes and no. And if we are careful with how we think about reliability, we can see that it has public good aspects, but then it also has private good aspects, because I can put a generator outside my house, or I can buy a UPS and plug my firewall into it, which I do. And so Eleanor Ostrom's Governing the Commons is a real foundational look at the bottom-up community self-governance that different communities discover to enable them to manage situations where they unavoidably have to have resources that they use in commons. So irrigation systems in Cambodia, fisheries in New Zealand, all of that.
Amazing. Thank you for the list.
Can you give us the single most impactful book? Oh, sorry, just Tim, before we're on we leave the book train, the single most impactful book about how you think about energy. Doesn't have to be an energy book.
Energy. Oh gosh. It's not a book. And it's completely cliche to anyone who knows me, but it's Hayek's 1945 American Economic Review paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society. And in particular, if you go, and it's easy to find if you just go Hayek, Use of Knowledge in Society, I think Liberty Fund website has it, and you can read it for free. But and it's kind of abstract and sometimes hard to read. But he's the guy who really articulates the extent to which the fundamental economic problem is one of coordination of the actions and plans of a bunch of people who have their own preferences, their own perceptions of their opportunity costs, and they don't know each other. And so how do we coordinate in that kind of setting? The price system is what creates opportunities for us to reveal some of our private knowledge. And that's why in the transactive work that Dave and I do, our primary focus, our primary design focus is on price discovery, right? And it's not price setting, it's price discovery, because markets are emergent phenomena. So that's the answer.
So
There's been
as
some really.
Sorry, Tim. Yeah, don't get out of
I'm
off.
trying.
go for it, Tim.
Go ahead, James. So I was going to say, so Lynne, you've really covered some fabulous stuff and some of the LA things against there. But one of the things that we're seeing here more in Australia, that's, I think, driving where the opportunities are for transactive energy or otherwise a consumer's agency, is actually understanding that some of the previous norms of coincident demand and things are separated. So there's a separation between what the generation coincident demand is and what the local network coincident capacity is. So when all our networks were sold off by the governments, they imposed very stringent controls to make sure that they didn't have blackouts caused by the networks. So we went through a period of gold plating, which everyone refers to very negatively, but at the end of the day, they did what they were asked to do. But the bottom line of it is we've got, through volumetric tariffs, these huge breaks that stop us doing things like demand shifting. We've got coarse tariffs that are there for time of use, or just a flat tariff that says, look, actually we've got a real problem with voltage excursion, so we need to actually create load. But at the same time as that we're getting negative energy prices, or even a local issue of voltage, the distribution tariff is at 40 cents. We've got all these other issues that aren't going into it. So we've got to think bigger about our use of networks and our services that go with that, to actually try and say, well, if we can actually do, I mean, you waved your phone around before and said, oh, look, we had this 13 years ago. That's a device of agency and power, but we can also have the processing power that's there to be able to tell people to do things, to activate charging EV or charge a local battery when energy prices are negative. We had a circumstance in South Australia 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, and I think, I'm sorry, Tim, to interrupt you, but my husband just stuck his head in to tell me that my dinner is getting cold. So, but
nasty husband.
I agree with you. We have to think big, but start small. And I think that this is going to be around the distribution edge and bottom up, but that we have to think big at the same time. I agree with you 100%. So
all right, Lynne,
yeah,
thank you so much for joining us. The last thing everybody wants to know is your opinion. Is Bitcoin a battery?
Jesus.
I'm just joking. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Get to your dinner. I hope it's
and
not
I'm
too
sorry, my
cold.
Wednesdays, I know you do stuff on Wednesdays, and I would love to join you. My Wednesdays are never a good night for me, but I hope to join you much more often. So thank you. This is a really great forum and a nice community. So thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. I hope your dinner has some thermal inertia.
Thanks. This is great.
Good night.
Thanks, Lynn.
See you, everybody.